40,000 feet over open water, a man stood up in the aisle with murder in his hands, and the federal air marshal hit the floor before he could even reach his weapon. What happened in the next 11 seconds? 211 people would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe and never quite manage. Because the only thing on that aircraft trained, calm, and willing to put its body between the cabin and the man with the blade, was a German Shepherd that, 6 hours earlier, a passenger in a $1,000 suit had tried to have thrown in the cargo hold. He'd called the handler sweetheart. He'd said dogs belong in cargo. He was about to find out exactly what that dog was. But to understand how a service animal ended up the last line of defense between a killer and a plane full of strangers, you have to go back to the jet bridge. To the moment a small, ugly decision got made by people who thought they were the safest ones on board. Let's start there. The man in seat 2C looked at the dog the way some men look at a thing that's gotten above its station. He'd been watching her since the jet bridge. The lean woman in the gray fleece and the worn boots. The one who didn't fit his idea of business class. The one with a German Shepherd the size of a small couch padding quiet at her left knee. He'd tracked her down the aisle. He'd watched her stow her bag, fold herself into 2D across from him, and murmur one low word to the dog. And the dog had dropped to the floor between her feet, chin on its paws, and gone still as furniture. That was when he decided he had a problem. "Excuse me." He didn't say it to her. He said it past her, snapping his fingers up the aisle toward the flight attendant. "Excuse me. There's an animal in this cabin." The woman in 2D didn't look up. She was checking the buckle on the dog's harness, running it through her fingers the way you run worry beads, an old habit, a thing her hands did without asking. The attendant came. Young, polished, the kind of smile they teach you. "Sir? Is everything all right?" "No," he gestured at the dog without looking at it. "I paid for this seat. I did not pay to sit 4 feet from a German Shepherd for 6 hours. I'm allergic. Frankly, I'm not comfortable. Can you move it? Back of the plane, cargo, I don't care." And here the woman in 2D spoke for the first time. Her voice was even, unbothered. The voice of someone who has had this conversation in more airports, in more languages, than this man had taken flights. "He's a working dog," she said. "He flies in the cabin. It's federal law." She reached into the seat pocket and drew out a slim folder, already worn soft at the corners, and held it across the aisle. Documentation. Service animal certification. A handler's credentials. The kind of paper that ends this conversation in any fair world. The man in 2C did not take it. He looked at it the way you'd look at a napkin someone had used. And then he said the thing, the small thing, the thing he'd carry out of this airplane and into the rest of his life whether he wanted to or not. "I don't care about your papers, sweetheart. Dogs belong in cargo." There it is. Sweetheart. The little word men reach for when they want to make a competent woman small. He set it down between them like he was doing her a favor. The attendant shifted her weight. She glanced at the folder still held out in the air. She glanced at the man in his $1,000 jacket, the man who clearly flew this route every week, the man who knew her supervisor's name. And she made the calculation that gets made 1,000 times a day at 30,000 feet and on the ground and everywhere people decide whose comfort is worth more. "Ma'am," she said gently, "would you maybe be more comfortable toward the back? We have room. It might be easier. For everyone." For everyone. Meaning for him. Now. For Roseback in 5C, there was a man who heard every word of this. He was not in uniform. He was in a charcoal blazer and an open collar, a paperback in his lap, a coffee going cold on his tray. He looked like a regional sales manager. He looked like nobody. That was the entire point of him. Because the man in 5C was a federal air marshal, and the whole architecture of his job was to be the most forgettable person on the aircraft. He had clocked the woman in 2D the second she boarded. It was reflex. He clocked everyone. And something in the back of his trained brain had filed a small, quiet note about her. The way she'd scanned the cabin on entry, exits first, then faces. The way she'd taken the seat with her back to the bulkhead. The way she sat, still and loose at the same time, ready without looking ready. His instinct, the good one, the one they'd trained into his bones, said, "That's one of ours. Some flavor of ours." And then the man in 2C opened his mouth, and the marshal had a choice. He could lean forward. He could quietly produce the badge that lived against his ribs and make this whole ugly little scene evaporate in 3 seconds. That's what the badge is for, partly, to settle a cabin before it gets loud, because loud is the enemy of a man whose job is to see trouble before anybody else does. Or he could stay invisible. Keep his cover. Avoid the paperwork, the attention, the report he'd have to file about why a marshal blew his anonymity over a seating dispute. He looked out the window. That's all. He turned his head a few degrees and looked at the gray morning sliding past the glass, and he let it happen. Not his problem. Some woman, some dog, some rich jerk. He'd see far worse before they landed if the day went bad, and the job was to save himself for that. That was the story he told himself, anyway, in the half-second it took to turn away. We'll come back to that look out the window. He will, too. He'll come back to it for the rest of his career. Across the aisle, the woman in 2D folded her documentation closed. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't make the speech she had every right to make. She'd been talked down to by colonels. She'd been told what she couldn't do by men who'd later owe her their lives and never quite managed to say thank you. A businessman in seat 2C, with his allergy he didn't have and his cargo hold he'd never seen, did not rate the energy. She just looked down at her dog. "Settle," she said softly. And the dog, who had not moved, settled deeper. Let out a long breath through his nose. And his eyes, and I want you to hold on to his eyes, because they're going to matter more than anything else on this aircraft. His eyes, a deep steady amber, drifted half-closed, and then opened again, and went on doing the only thing they ever really did. Watching. The doors closed. The jet bridge pulled away. And a flight that 211 people boarded, thinking it was ordinary, pushed back from the gate. It was not going to be ordinary. Here is what the man in 2C did not know about the woman he'd called sweetheart. Her name was Devon Marsh. Staff Sergeant, United States Army, though she wasn't wearing anything that said so, because she was flying home on leave and home clothes were the whole point of leave. She was 34 years old. She had spent the better part of a decade in places this man would have paid not to think about, doing a job most people don't know exists until it saves their life. She was a dog handler. Not the kind that does tricks. The kind that walks point. And the animal asleep between her boots, the one bound for the cargo hold in the imagination of the man across the aisle, had a name too. Ajax. But we'll get to what Ajax was. And what Ajax had already done once, in a place very far from this aircraft, that the Army doesn't put on paper. For now, the plane climbed. The seatbelt light went off. The man in 2C ordered a drink and put on his headphones and forgot all about it, the way you forget about something small you broke that wasn't yours. And 4 rows back, the marshal opened his paperback and didn't read a single word, and watched the gray ocean appear beneath them, and told himself it was going to be a quiet flight. The thing about Devon Marsh is that she'd stopped expecting people to see her a long time ago. It wasn't bitterness. Bitterness takes energy, and she didn't have any to spare for it. It was just arithmetic. People look at a 34-year-old woman in a fleece and worn boots and they fill in the blanks themselves, and the blanks they fill in are never the truth, and after a few years of that you stop bothering to correct them. You let them think what they think. You do your job. The dog at your knee knows what you are, and that's the only opinion on the aircraft that's ever actually mattered. Because here's what 8 years of that job teaches you. The thing no amount of arguing across an aisle can buy you. The loudest threat in any room is almost never the real one. The real one is quiet. The real one is sitting still, looking ordinary, waiting. The real one looks like nothing at all until the exact moment it stops looking like nothing. And by then, if you've been watching the loud one, you're already too late. Devon had learned that lesson the hard way, in a country she didn't talk about, in a year she didn't talk about either. She'd been 26. Knew enough to still believe the briefing when it told her where the danger was. Her team had been clearing a road, a long dust-choked artery that a supply convoy needed by morning, and the briefing said the threat was the obvious one. The culvert. The dead goat in the ditch. The freshly turned dirt by the marker. Textbook. Everybody's eyes went to the textbook. Everybody's except the dog's. She'd had a different dog then. Older. A grizzled Malinois named Rook who was 2 months from retirement and had survived long enough to be smarter than most of the officers giving him orders. And Rook had walked right past the culvert. Past the dead goat. Past the turned dirt that had 3 lieutenants crouched and sweating. Rook had stopped at a pile of trash by a wall 100 feet back. A pile everyone had already walked through. A pile that wasn't on anybody's list because it wasn't obvious. And Rook had sat down. Just sat. The signal. The quiet, undramatic, life or death signal that says, here. Not where you're all looking. Here. They'd found enough explosive in that trash pile to take the front third of the convoy with it. Command wired. Patient. Set by someone who understood exactly how a young soldier's eyes get pulled to the dramatic thing while the real thing waits in the garbage everyone's already decided is safe. 11 men crossed that road by morning who would not have crossed anything, ever again, if a tired old dog hadn't ignored the briefing and trusted his nose. Nobody wrote Rook up for it. Dogs don't get medals, not real ones, not the kind that go on a record. But Devon never forgot the shape of it. The lesson under the lesson. Watch the quiet thing. The quiet one already knows how it ends. Rook retired. Rook died eventually, the way old soldiers should, slow warm, on a porch, full of stolen food. And the army handed Devon a green, ferocious, 80-pound problem named Ajax, and told her to make a partner out of him. That took 2 years. What Ajax was, by the time he was lying between her boots at 30,000 feet, was something the recruiting posters don't quite capture. He was a detection dog, yes, explosives primarily, the slow patient work of walking point and reading the air. But he was also the other thing the best of them become, the thing that doesn't fit on a job description. He was a dog who had, once, put his entire body between Devon and a man who'd come out of a doorway with a knife. That's the part the Army doesn't put on paper. The official record says Ajax has explosive detection certification and a clean service history. It does not say that on a narrow street, on a day that was supposed to be routine, a man had lunged for Devon's back, and Ajax had crossed 8 feet of open ground in under a second and hit him chest high and put him on the floor before Devon had even finished turning around. It does not say that Ajax took a cut across the shoulder doing it, a long shallow line that healed into a pale scar you could still find under his fur if you knew where to look. It does not say that Devon had spent that night in a field aid station with her hand on her dog's flank, learning the single most important fact of her life, that this animal would die for her without a half-second's hesitation. And the only way to honor that was to never, ever let it come to that if she could help it. So she watched the quiet things. She sat with her back to the bulkhead. She read exits before faces. And she ran her thumb over the buckle of his harness like worry beads, not because she was anxious, but because the harness was the contract between them, and her hands liked to remember it was there. The man in 2C saw none of this. He saw a woman and a dog and an inconvenience. He had his headphones on now. He was on his second drink. The cabin had gone into the long gray hum of a transoceanic flight. The lights dimmed, the shades half-drawn, 211 people surrendering to the boredom that is the great mercy of air travel. Movies flickering. Someone's baby finally, mercifully asleep. The Marshal in 5C working through his cold coffee, eyes half-lidded, looking like a man counting the hours to a hotel bed. And up in the back third of the cabin, in an aisle seat in economy, a man Devon had noticed at the gate sat very still and did not watch a movie. She'd clocked him the way she clocked everyone. Mid-40s. Neat. A windbreaker he hadn't taken off even though the cabin was warm. He'd boarded with no carry-on but a small worn day bag he kept on his lap instead of overhead. He hadn't eaten. He hadn't slept. He hadn't reclined. He just sat. Hands folded on the bag. Eyes forward. Lips moving, every so often, around words she couldn't hear. Devon noticed him the way you notice a door that's open a half-inch wider than the others on the hallway. Not alarm. Just a note. A small filed note, the kind 8 years teaches you to make and not act on, because most open doors are nothing. Most quiet men are just tired. Most of the time the briefing is right and the trash pile is just trash. But under her boots, Ajax's head had come up off his paws. Just slightly. Just an inch. His nostrils worked slow, drawing the recycled cabin air across whatever map of the world lived inside that nose. And his amber eyes, the eyes I asked you to hold on to, were no longer half-closed. They were open. And they were pointed, steady, and unblinking, down the length of the aircraft toward the back third of the cabin. Devon felt him change before she saw it. Felt it through the floor, through the leash, through 8 years of a language that has no words. Her hand found the buckle of his harness and stopped moving. "Easy," she breathed. Barely a sound. "Easy, bud. What VE you got?" Ajax didn't look at her. Ajax kept watching the quiet man in the windbreaker. And 4 hours from the nearest land, with the gray ocean rolling black beneath them and 211 people asleep in their seats, Staff Sergeant Devon Marsh sat very still, and put her hand flat on her dog's back, and began, quietly, without a single person noticing, to count the seconds. There's a particular kind of stillness a body holds when it's getting ready to do something it's already decided on. Devon knew that stillness. She'd seen it across checkpoints and in doorways and once terribly, on the face of a boy who couldn't have been more than 19, in the half-second before everything went wrong. It isn't fear. Fear fidgets. Fear looks for exits. This was the other thing, the stillness of a man who has stopped looking for exits because he's already chosen the one he's taking. The man in the windbreaker had that stillness. He'd unfolded his hands. That was the first thing. The folded hands on the day bag had come apart, and now one of them rested flat on top of the bag and the other had slipped to the side of it, to the zipper, and it stayed there. Not moving. Just resting. The way your hand rests on something you're about to open. His lips were still moving. Devon was close enough now, in the wide-awake way her whole body had gone, to understand that he wasn't muttering. He was reciting. The same short shape of words, over and over, the cadence of a man saying the thing you say to yourself when you've decided not to come back. She did the math the way you do it when there's no time to do it slowly. A marshal somewhere on the aircraft, almost certainly. She didn't know it was the tired man in 5C, but she knew the route and the rules and the odds said there was an armed federal officer on this plane. Good. That was the cavalry. But the cavalry was asleep, or might as well be, and the cavalry was somewhere she couldn't see, and the man with his hand on the zipper was 30 feet away and counting down inside his own head. And between them, between the quiet man and the 210 people who had no idea, there was a narrow aisle, a drink cart 3 rows up, and a staff sergeant nobody on this aircraft believed was anything at all. Here is the thing they never tell you about people who train for the worst day of someone else's life. They are not brave the way the movies are brave. There's no music. There's no swell of certainty. There's just a cold, clean arithmetic that runs underneath the fear, faster than the fear, and it says, if not me, who? If not now, when? And the answer to both is right here, right now, and there's nobody else. Devon Marsh looked at the man in the windbreaker, and looked at his hand on the zipper, and made the decision that the marshal in 5C had not made when he turned to the window. She was going to move. Not yet. You don't move on a man like that from 30 feet and a seated start. You give him the half-second he needs to do the thing he's deciding to do. You move when you've closed the distance. You move when you're close enough that your hands reach him before his hand finishes what it's reaching for. Which meant she had to get up out of her seat, in business class, 4 hours over open water, and walk casually toward the back of an aircraft toward the one man on it she decided was death, and do it so smoothly that he never registered her as a threat until she was on top of him. And she had to do it with 80 pounds of dog who would not, under any circumstance, let her walk toward danger alone. She put her mouth close to Ajax's ear. "With me," she breathed. "Quiet. Hill." Ajax rose. Not a sound. 80 pounds of muscle coming up off the cabin floor like smoke, and the only thing you'd have heard if you were sitting right next to it was the soft click of his nails finding the carpet, and then nothing, because a dog like Ajax knows the difference between walking and working, and he had known which one this was before Devon said a single word. She stepped into the aisle. And the marshal in 5C, God bless him, the training never fully sleeps even when the man does, felt it. Felt the wrongness of it. A passenger up, a dog up, both moving aft with a purpose that didn't match a trip to the lavatory. His eyes came open. His cold coffee forgotten. He sat up a half-inch, the paperback sliding off his knee, his hand drifting on instinct toward the weapon under his blazer, his brain scrambling up out of the gray fog of altitude and boredom and trying, far too late, to read a board that had already been set. He saw the woman. He saw the dog. He saw past them, the man in the windbreaker with his hand on the bag. And he understood, in one sick lurch, 3 things at once. That there was a threat on his aircraft. That a civilian, the one he'd let them try to ship to cargo, the one he'd turned to the window rather than help, had seen it before he did. And that he was 4 rows back and a beat behind, and the distance between him and the windbreaker ran straight through the moving bodies of a woman and a dog, which meant the one thing a federal air marshal is trained never to do. He did not have a clear lane. He started to rise. That's when the man in the windbreaker stood up. He came up fast, the stillness breaking all at once, the way a held breath breaks, and the daybag came up with him, clutched to his chest with one arm, and the other hand wasn't on the zipper anymore. The other hand had come out of the bag, and in it was the dull, unmistakable shape of a blade, a short, ugly thing, ceramic maybe, the kind that walks through a checkpoint in pieces and gets put together in a lavatory at 30,000 feet by a man who has all the time in the world and nothing left to lose. He turned. Not toward Devon. Toward the front of the aircraft. Toward the flight deck. Toward the long aisle full of sleeping people and the locked door at the end of it and whatever was waiting in his head on the other side of that door. And the marshal, finally up, finally clear of his seat, opened his mouth to shout the word, the one word, federal officer, the word that's supposed to freeze a cabin, and never got to finish it. Because the man in the windbreaker, fast and committed and already gone somewhere past reason, pivoted into the marshal's rising shout and drove the blade low and hard into the only armed man on the aircraft, and the marshal folded over it with a sound that wasn't a word at all, and went down into the aisle between the seats, and the weapon he'd carried for exactly this moment stayed holstered under a body that could no longer reach it. For one frozen quarter-second, the whole aircraft hung in the silence of 209 people who had not yet woken up to what was happening. And then there was only one thing left standing in that aisle between a man with a blade and a plane full of strangers. It was not a soldier. It was not a marshal. It was an 80-pound German shepherd that a man in a $1,000 suit had tried 6 hours ago to have thrown in the cargo hold, already low, already coiled, amber eyes locked on the threat, waiting for the only voice in the world he'd take this from. And behind him, Staff Sergeant Devon Marsh said the word. Ajax Fass. The old word. The working word. The German the army never bothers to translate because a dog doesn't need the translation, and the word carries 8 years of meaning in a single hard syllable. It means take. It means now. It means the thing we trained for every day of your life is the thing that is happening, and I trust you and go. Ajax went 80 pounds off a standing start in a 6-foot aisle, and the physics of it were merciless and total. He didn't bark. The best ones don't. Barking is for dogs that want you to know they're coming, and Ajax did not want this man to know anything until it was already over. He came low and silent, and he hit the man in the windbreaker exactly where 8 years of training and one unforgettable street in a country Devon didn't talk about had taught him to hit. High at the arm, the weapon arm, the whole driving weight of him slamming into the wrist and forearm that held the blade. The man went sideways into a seat back. The blade came down, but it came down wrong, knocked off its line, and instead of a throat or a chest it found upholstery, buried in a headrest 2 inches from a sleeping woman who woke into a nightmare and started to scream. And then the aircraft woke up all at once. You've never heard a sound like 200 people understanding danger in the same half-second. It isn't one scream. It's a wave. It rolls front to back, seat by seat, as the knowledge passes through the cabin faster than anyone can turn around, and under it is the animal roar of bodies trying to get away from a thing in a space where there is nowhere to go. Devon did not hear any of it. That's the other thing the training does. It narrows the world down to a corridor about 3 feet wide with only the necessary things inside it. The necessary things were the blade, the arm, her dog, the down Marshal, and the holstered weapon under him that she needed and could not yet reach. The man with the blade was strong, and he was not done, and he did the thing desperate men do. He turned all that strength on the dog, because the dog was the immediate problem, the 80 pounds of muscle clamped onto his forearm. He slammed his arm against the seat back again, trying to crush Ajax off him, and he wrenched, and he twisted, and Ajax did not let go, because letting go was the one thing in his entire vocabulary that did not exist. He rode it. He absorbed the slam against the steel and plastic and bone of the seat frame, and he kept the arm, kept the weapon arm pinned and useless, and he bought the seconds. That was the whole job. Not to win. To buy the seconds. And Devon spent them. She covered the last 8 feet in the time it takes to read this sentence. And she did not go for the man. Going for an armed man when your dog already has his weapon arm is how you both die. She went low. She went for the Marshal crumpled in the aisle, and her hands found his blazer and found the holster under it, and she drew the weapon with the clean economy of someone who has drawn 100,000 times in the dark with her eyes closed, because that is how they make sure your hands know it when your mind is screaming. She came up with the gun in a 2-handed grip, and her body squared, and her voice cut through the cabin's roar like something forged. Don't move. Don't you move. The man froze. Not because of the gun, maybe. A man who's already decided not to come back isn't always stopped by a gun. He froze because of the totality of it. The dog locked on his arm, the woman over the Marshal with a federal sidearm steady and level and 6 feet from his face, the eyes behind that sidearm that were not afraid, that he could see were not afraid, that had clearly been here, in some version of here, many times before and walked away every time. For 1 second, the whole thing balanced on a wire. Then Devon said, low and absolutely flat, with no anger in it at all, which is the most frightening way a person can say anything. Open your hand. Let the knife go. You do it now, you live. You count to 2, you don't. Drop it. The blade hit the carpet. AUS, Devon said, release, and Ajax let go of the arm and dropped back a half step and stayed there, coiled 6 inches of bared readiness, watching, because AUS means let go of the bite, but it does not mean stop working, and Ajax knew the difference the way he knew his own name. On the floor. Face down. Hands behind you. The man went down. Whatever had been holding him up, the recitation, the decision, the terrible momentum of a plan, it was gone now, collapsed out of him, and what was left was just a man face down in an aisle, shaking, while a dog he'd never see again watched him with patient amber eyes from a foot away. And then there were hands. Other hands. The cabin's slow shock breaking into action. Two big men from economy who'd come up the aisle when the screaming started. A flight attendant with the plastic restraints they carry for exactly this and pray they never use. Devon directed it all in short, clean words without ever lowering the weapon or her eyes. Because the threat was contained, but containment is not the same as over, and she'd learned that lesson in a place she didn't talk about too. Belt his hands. Tight. Tighter. I don't care if it hurts. Sit on him if he moves. You to the attendant. I need the senior cabin crew, and I need them to tell the flight deck we have one attacker down and restrained and a federal officer with a stab wound. And I need a doctor on this airplane right now, out loud, asked the cabin. And only then, only when the man was zip-tied and pinned under 200 pounds of furious stranger, only when the weapon was secured and the world had stopped narrowing, did Devon turn to the marshal on the floor. He was alive. He was looking up at her. His hand was pressed to his side, and the blood was coming through his fingers dark and steady, but not the bright pulsing kind. Not yet. And his face was gray and his eyes were full of a thing she recognized because she'd worn it herself once, in an aid station, with her hand on a dog's flank. It was shame. I saw it, he said. His voice came thin. At the gate. The dog. I saw you. I knew you were, and I turned. I turned to the window. I let them try to send your dog to, he stopped. Swallowed. I'm sorry. Don't. Devon was already down on her knees beside him, already taking his hand off the wound and replacing it with the heel of her own, leaning her weight in, doing the next thing and the next thing because that is all there ever is. Don't do that now. Now you stay awake and you look at me. What's your name? Tom. Tom Aldridge. Tom. You're going to be fine, Tom. You hear me? I've patched worse than this in worse places than this. True. Stay with me. Help's coming. And it was. A doctor, 3 rows back, climbing over seats. The crew. The cavalry, finally, all of it arriving in the messy, grateful flood that comes after the moment that actually mattered has already passed. Devon kept the pressure on Tom Aldridge's side. And without looking, without taking her eyes off the marshal's face, she said one more word into the roaring cabin, soft, the way you'd say it to family. Ajax. Here. And the dog came. And as Devon worked to keep a stranger alive on the floor of an aircraft at 30,000 feet, Ajax pressed himself the length of her side, warm and solid and breathing hard, and she felt it, felt the wet heat soaking into her hip where his shoulder met her, and looked down and saw it. The old scar on his shoulder had opened. The slam against the seat frame again and again, holding the arm, buying the seconds, it had torn the old wound back open, and a fresh dark line of red was running down his leg and onto the carpet and onto her. He'd bled for her again. Of course he had. It was the only language he'd ever needed. I know, Bud, Devon said very quietly, and her voice cracked for the first and only time in the whole thing. I know. I've got you. Settle. Settle. And Ajax, 80 pounds of the thing a man in a $1,000 suit had wanted in the cargo hold, the last line of defense between a killer and 209 sleeping strangers, let out a long breath through his nose and pressed closer and settled. The flight didn't land where it was supposed to. You don't carry an attacker and a bleeding federal officer across an ocean when there's a runway closer. The captain, a calm gray voice over the intercom that told 209 shaking people exactly enough and not one word more, turned the aircraft and put it down at the nearest field with a kind of soft, careful landing that pilots save for the days when the cabin behind them has already been through enough. But a lot happened in the hour before that runway. An hour is a long time at 30,000 feet with a man zip-tied in the aisle and a marshal on the floor. And in that hour, 209 people who had spent the first half of the flight asleep got to watch, in detail, exactly who had been sitting among them. They watched a doctor and a staff sergeant keep Tom Aldridge alive with a first aid kit and 4 bottles of water and a folded blanket and a steadiness that never once broke. They watched Devon run it, all of it, in that flat, clean, unhurried voice, telling the crew what to do, telling the big men on the attacker how to keep him down without hurting him worse than the law allowed, telling Tom to stay awake, telling him about a dog named Rook and a road in a country she didn't name, just to keep his eyes open, just to give him something to hold. And they watched the dog. The dog never left her side. Bleeding from the old wound torn new, Ajax lay pressed the length of Devon's hip the entire hour, and every few minutes his amber eyes would track back down the aisle to the man on the floor, just to be sure, just to check the math, and then return to his handler. Watching the threat. Watching her. The only 2 things on the aircraft he had ever needed to watch. People take out their phones at moments like this. Of course they do. So there is footage, there will always be footage now, of a woman in a gray fleece kneeling in a bloody aisle with her hands on a stranger's wound and a wounded German shepherd against her side, and a voice off camera, some passenger, saying softly over and over, the way people do when they don't know what else to do with what they're feeling. Who is she? Who is that? Who are they? And the man in 2C heard that question. He was still in his seat. He'd been told to stay in it, and for once in his life he'd done exactly what he was told, because somewhere in the last hour the entire architecture of who he believed himself to be had quietly come apart. He had watched the woman he called sweetheart draw a weapon off a dying man's body with hands that did not shake. He had watched the dog he wanted in cargo take a knife arm at full speed and hold it long enough to save the life of every person in the cabin, including his. That arithmetic had landed on him somewhere around minute 20, and it had not gotten lighter since. He had said dogs belong in cargo, and the dog had been the only thing standing between him and a man with a blade. When the aircraft was on the ground, and the doors were open, and the paramedics came up the aisle in a fast, clean line, when they had Tom Aldridge on a board with Devon walking beside him still holding pressure until the very last second a professional could honestly hand it off, the man in 2C did a thing he had not planned and could barely understand. He stood up. And as Devon passed his row, finally, blood drying dark on her hands and her hip, the dog limping faithful at her left knee, the man opened his mouth. He didn't have the words. Men like that almost never do. What came out was small and broken and inadequate, and the only true thing he'd said all flight. I didn't, he stopped. Tried again. Thank you. I'm sorry. I didn't know what I didn't. Devon stopped. She looked at him. Not with anger. She didn't have any to spare. She'd never had any to spare. She looked at him the way you look at weather, at a thing that simply is what it is, and she let the silence sit on him for 1 full second, because he'd earned that second and they both knew it. And then she said the only thing she was ever going to say to him. He never belonged in cargo. She looked down at Ajax, then back up. And neither did I. And she walked off the aircraft. The rest is the part that doesn't fit in an hour, so it gets told in pieces, the way these things always do. Tom Aldridge lived. The blade had missed everything that mattered by the width of a steady hand keeping pressure where it needed to be. He spent 4 days in a hospital in a city he'd never meant to visit, and on the second day a nurse told him there was a woman in the waiting room who'd refused to leave until she knew he'd pulled through, and who had a dog with her, and who the hospital was very politely pretending not to notice the dog because nobody on the staff had the heart to be the one to make her go. He asked them to bring her in. I won't tell you everything that passed between a federal air marshal and the soldier who'd done his job better than he had, because some of it was just 2 professionals sitting in a quiet room, and some things between people like that don't need a witness. But I'll tell you he tried again, to apologize for the window. For turning away at the gate. For the half-second of not my problem that had nearly cost the whole aircraft everything. And I'll tell you what Devon said, because it's the thing worth keeping. You turned away at the gate, she said. And then on that airplane, when it counted, you stood up and you opened your mouth to call it out, and you took a knife meant for the cockpit door. You don't get to keep the first part and throw away the second. You did the job, Tom. You just did it a beat behind a dog. Welcome to my whole life. He laughed. It hurt his stitches. He didn't care. The attacker is a story for the people whose job is attackers. The investigators, the courts, the quiet, serious men who came and took careful statements and shook Devon's hand and looked at Ajax with a particular respect of people who understand exactly what 80 pounds of trained dog had prevented. What he'd intended, who he was, what waited at the end of the recitation on his lips. That's their story to close, and they closed it. 209 people went home because they never got the chance to find out the ending he'd planned. Ajax got 11 stitches in his shoulder. He got something else too eventually, a small ceremony, a citation, the kind of recognition the Army doesn't usually give a working dog but made an exception for, because some things are too big to leave off the paper. Devon stood next to him in her dress uniform, the one that finally told everyone at a glance what the fleece never had, and she kept one hand resting lightly on his back the whole time, on the harness, running her thumb over the buckle like worry beads. An old habit. A thing her hands did. The contract between them. Still there. And there's footage of that, too. Of course there is. But the picture that went everywhere, the one people kept, the one that got printed and shared and stuck to refrigerators by people who'd never met a soldier or a service dog in their lives, wasn't the ceremony. It was a still frame somebody had pulled from the shaky phone video on the aircraft. Devon kneeling in the bloody aisle, both hands pressed to a stranger's side, her face turned down and absolutely calm. And beside her, pressed the length of her body, wounded and faithful and utterly unwilling to be anywhere else, a German shepherd with his head up. Watching. Those amber eyes, the ones I asked you, way back at the start of all this, to hold on to, pointed not at the camera, not at the man on the floor, not at the chaos rolling through the cabin. Pointed at her. Because that was the only thing those eyes had ever really done. Not in a trash pile on a road in a country she didn't talk about. Not in a doorway with a man and a knife. Not at 30,000 feet with a plane full of sleeping strangers behind him. Watch the quiet thing. Stand between her and whatever's coming. And never ever let go of the bite until she says the word. A man in a $1,000 suit had looked at all of that and seen something to put in the cargo hold. The dog had looked back at him, and at the woman beside him, and at the long aisle full of strangers he would bleed to protect, and known the way he knew his own name, exactly where he belonged. Right there. At her left knee. Watching. Where he'd been the whole time.